You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 455 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the Senate standing up to Trump on Iran war powers and the new Cold War. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online over at the Libertarian Institute. I also write the news roundup at the Libertarian Institute, and the show could be found on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to somewhere. The show has its own podcast feed that's up everywhere. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. Lastly, you donate to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so I missed a week of shows when I was sick, and I have some news stories on today's show, and I all think they have to do kind of with the Pentagon in ways realigning itself and preparing itself for great power competition against Russia and China. So I think part of this is the creation of the Space Force as a CITS branch and moving budgetary stuff, personnel, and looking to weaponize space. Well, I'm sure weaponizing space will be useful against Iran, North Korea, and, put air quotes around useful. I think the Pentagon will see it that way. I don't, think it'll actually make Americans safer, obviously. But I do, think that's a benefit they'll have. Satellites and stuff like that may make it easier for them to surveil terrorists or operate more drones, shut down different kinds of communications. And so I'm guessing they'll see it as useful for everything. But I do think the primary focus here is on Russia and China. So within the next year, 6,000 personnel from the Air Force join currently the only member of the actual uniformed Space Force, General J. Raymond, as members of the Space Force. Right now, there's about 1,600 people working for the Space Force, but they all either work for different military branches or are civilian. There's also 100 members of the Army that are preparing to transfer to the Space Force, although that won't happen till 2021. As I've talked about on the show, the main concern here with the Space Force is that it kicks off an arms weapons race with especially the great powers Russia and China as the U.S. moves more weaponry into space. But I don't think it discounts that there's going to be other countries looking. I mean, India has a space program. Iran has been looking at attempting to launch their first satellite. North Korea has attempted satellite launches. I'm not sure if they actually have made one into orbit. I believe Iran has not. But, Russia and China have advanced space programs, and them rightfully identifying, and, this has been laid out in the Pentagon's national security strategy, and we've seen it reflected in the budget, that they will see themselves as a target of the expanding space program and will likely look to weaponize space with their own missiles or different technologies in response. Right now, space, while it does have some military purposes, obviously, with just different military satellites and stuff like that, it is really a commercial ground, and hopefully it will stay that way. We'll focus on putting satellites in space that, increase our ability to connect with the world, track different things, and overall, just make us all more prosperous and easier access to the internet and information, all the things we love that make life great. But if it moves towards weaponization, just like other industries, you're going to see the civilian technology suffer. Trump's budget proposal for fiscal year 2021 includes just under $600,000 to establish a military presence in Greenland. We've seen over the past year or so throughout the Trump presidency, I suppose, the Trump administration increasingly looking to the Arctic as ways to combat Russia in the grand scheme of great strategy. And I believe their main submarine base is up in the north of their country. And so the way, it gets out from the Arctic is down around Iceland and the UK. And so the US has been looking to, I believe it's a Swedish air base that they're looking to improve, and just generally increasing the military presence in the area. And while, I laughed early in the Trump presidency when Trump talked about buying Greenland, that seems like a rather ridiculous proposal still, that they would be willing to sell, or the U.S. would actually buy it. But looking to increase first diplomatic and then military presence on the very large island would not be surprising. All right, the last thing I got on this is AFRICOM, that's Africa Command, confirms it will reduce the size of the U.S. force deployed in Africa to reorient against Russia and China. I know a lot of the forces deployed to Africa are special operations forces, and so my guess is that they're going to be redeployed either to the Pacific or Eastern Europe in order to, run war games and stuff there. In one sense, it's not a terrible thing that the U.S. is withdrawing some troops from Africa, where they're probably getting involved in local and regional conflicts that the U.S. is better off out of, or probably shifting power balances, and, kind of further spreading the jihad. If you look at what's happened in, the Sahel region in West Africa since the 2011 war in Libya, I mean, scores of people are being killed every week in massacres by militants. There's ongoing fighting and instability in the region, and a lot of that is because of the U.S. intervention in Libya. And so the less of that we're doing, probably a better thing. The problem is reorienting the forces towards Russia and China is just problematic as well, increasing the new Cold War, and at times where we could really be ramping down tension with the other powers. The Soviet Union fell apart 30 years ago. Donald Trump at least came into office a lot of people are afraid of, but on some rhetoric that talked about getting along better with Russia, increasing economic ties with these countries and improving everybody's standard of living rather than this hostile foreign policy. Of course, one problem the United States is going to have with getting itself into a new Cold War is we simply can't afford it. Mike Meharry, a previous guest on the show, communications director at 10th Amendment Center, has a good article out I think ran both at the Libertarian Institute and over at 10th Amendment Center that explains the U.S. ran tens of billions of dollar deficit in January and is on pace to run $1 trillion deficit for fiscal year 2020. And so with that, our already 20 plus trillion dollar debt and adding another trillion this year, and hell, we're in a Republican presidency, so apparently they're slashing benefits and everything. Well, that's obviously not what's going on. The U.S. government is spending just as much as it has really since 2000 on. More money is going to be wasted on building the border. They're apparently taking $3.8 billion from the Pentagon and using it to build the border wall. I'm sure there's a lot of corruption in these contracts, as apparently the Department of Homeland Security is waiving the federal requirements on how you're supposed to get contracts and vendors through the government, which likely means they're, just taking one bid and giving the contract to whoever. There's also problems now with them destroying Indian burial grounds in the process of building this wall. Obviously this wall is ridiculous and isn't going to achieve its stated end. It's just another huge waste of taxpayer dollars, along with the increased police presence in the United States from trying to enforce the ridiculous immigration laws. All right, so Assange's lawyers generated some headline, and I just want to start off, I guess, by saying I haven't seen an actual transcript of what Assange's lawyer said, but the general headline is Assange's lawyer say he was offered a pardon from Donald Trump for saying Russia had nothing to do with hacking or getting into Hillary Clinton's emails and giving them to WikiLeaks. That this message, I guess, was relayed to Assange by Dana Rohrabacher. Now, the White House has denied it, and Dana Rohrabacher has put out a statement basically saying that it's being misrepresented. He was pretty clear with WikiLeaks that when he made this offer, he was saying that if Assange came out and did confirm that, which, Assange has said time and time again anyways, and hasn't gotten a pardon for it, that he would support Assange getting a pardon to Trump. So again, I'm not sure exactly what Assange's lawyer said or what point he was, attempting to make with making this argument. But I think big reason to talk about this is that the headlines specifically are trying to make this out to be like this is a cover-up and Assange was offered this deal by Trump in a way to like hide the conspiracy of the 2016 election. Obviously, Assange didn't get the pardon, so if that's what was being offered, it didn't play out. But, the whole thing is just ridiculous. There is no evidence that Russia hacked Hillary Clinton's emails. And as I've talked about time and time again on the show, the whole Russiagate thing is a lie. It was just kind of a sneaky way they put it forward. And it is quite amazing how many publications and people still believe the Russiagate narrative. All right, so quickly here, the Senate vote on the Iran War Powers bill. This basically is Congress reasserting what the Constitution says, so they shouldn't have to say it at all. But they do, that the president doesn't have authority from Congress to start a war with Iran. Vote was, I believe, 55-45 with 8 Republicans voting with almost all the Democrats. Still well short, though, of the veto proof, and Trump has threatened to veto this bill. It is encouraging to see that, there is enough votes they can get together in the Senate. And this is the second time during the Trump presidency that Congress... Well, the first time both the House and Senate passed a Yemen War Powers bill, but this time the Senate passed it, and it realistically should pass the House. So, we'll see what happens when it comes to a vote in the House and what Trump's going to do if he'll veto it and what course of action Congress will take from there. But it is great to see Congress increasingly, because before it was just all authorization from war. So it's still not very much, but some Congress action being taken to try to limit presidential war-making powers, at least some. All right. News on Afghanistan. The second place finisher in the Afghan election, Abdullah. On the last show, I had talked about how an election that happened in September with everybody claiming victory since and a whole bunch of disputes and these votes don't count and these do, all kinds of confusion. A lot of polling sites weren't even opened. The current president, Ghani, had claimed victory in the Afghan Election Commission had said so. Well, the guy who came in second with about 40% of the vote, according to the official numbers, is saying that, nope, that's a coup. He's apparently forbid the election commission from leaving the country. Not sure how much enforcement power, and he plans to put together his own government. And so, this is just one of those stories, the absurdity. We've now even had the Washington Post with their Afghanistan papers, paint the picture clear enough that this war has been an absolute failure. There's no way we're going to install democracy in Afghanistan. It's time to... All right, so some talks that either are or not happening around the Middle East. The talks hosted by Oman between Saudi Arabia and Iran have apparently failed to materialize, and it seems like any progress that was being made up to the assassination of Soleimani, in any kind of reduction tensions and backroom handshakes between the Saudis and Iranians seem to be on ice. Same with any talks to end the GCC dispute. This is the first couple of months of the Trump administration. Tillerson is still the Secretary of State, and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and several other of the Sunni Arab states all agreed to blockade and cut diplomatic relations with Qatar, and almost similar to the list of demands Pompeo issued to Iran. Basically, we're asking the Qataris to give up their foreign policy and a lot of their sovereignty in order to break the blockade. This has resulted to the Qataris being closer to Iran and Turkey. And the situation, I guess, kind of stabilized there with Qatar seem to be able to hold out the blockade. Well, a couple months ago, we heard reports that talks were developing between the two sides, but now it doesn't seem like that is progressing. Saudi Arabia says talks are progressing with the Houthis. Unfortunately, I really don't believe much of what comes out of Saudi Arabia, and it's been almost a year now of talks between those two sides progressing. We had increased violence in the past week or so with a Saudi UK tornado going down. The Houthis claim it was shot down. I think the Saudis at least implied that it wasn't shot down. And Saudi Arabia responding by bombing Houthi areas of Yemen, killing 31 civilians. There was also fighting in the east of Yemen along the border of Oman, where there's some tribal fighters there who I would imagine are not aligned with the Houthis, and they were fired upon by the Saudis. I don't know if this is a related event or not, but apparently in another area of the Yemeni government held areas of Yemen, which would mean, the Saudi proxy forces, there was a convoy of Yemeni government troops carrying the Yemeni defense minister, and it was hit with some kind of IED. Although the defense minister escaped, 6 people were killed. Apparently, John Kerry, Chris Murphy, and 2 other Democrat senators held a secret meeting with Iran. I'm not sure what came out of this or if anything's going to be moving forward, but any kind of diplomatic talks between the two sides here is great. In Syria, things are extremely complicated. As I've talked about on the past couple of shows, increased hostilities in the northern area where the al-Nusra and now Turkish-backed rebels hold parts of the Idlib province of Syria, and the Syrian government, along with the Russians, are advancing. Turkey has been threatening to mobilize forces and fight back. They've warned Russia that this is going to be their course of action. It's not clear what Erdogan would actually hope to achieve by invading Syria here, and it seems like it would be, a quagmire and a mess for his country. And then in the east of the country, I'm not quite sure exactly where this is happening, but there's increasing run-ins between the U.S. and Russian or Syrian forces. So far, this has, remained fairly, we'll call it civil, where you had like a U.S. vehicle running a Russian vehicle off the road, but we haven't seen exchanges of fire, people dropping bombs on each other, and, a solution needs to be worked out here. Unfortunately, I don't think Donald Trump really has the wherewithal at this point to sit down, look at Syria policy seriously, and remove U.S. troops from that country, understanding there's nothing they can really accomplish, and they're just in harm's way, potentially provoking a larger confrontation with Russia. All right, everybody, I know it's another short show, but the voice is barely holding up as I'm still recovering from my week of the flu. I really appreciate everybody turning in. Hopefully be back up to full-length shows next week and get out 3 of them. So I appreciate everybody listening. I appreciate when you share the show. Remember, check out the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor. The show's featured on the homepage, and I write the daily news roundup. Twitter at KYAAALE. Private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Subscribe to the show and donate on Patreon.